Now that we looked at the idea that an LBO is very similar to buying a house, let's actually use a real example of an LBO. We're going to still keep it pretty simple, but the logic of it is very much like buying a house. So we're going to look at the Dell LBO. This is one of the highest profile LBOs over the last couple of years. And we're going to do a simple cocktail napkin exercise to try to arrive at the IRRs that were expected in that actual LBO. So this is something we're going to do before we dive into a full-scale model, right? Once you're building a full LBO model, there's a lot of bells and whistles and a lot of potential distractions to the core idea of how an LBO works. So let's look at this case study. So the offer on February 2013 was that Michael Dell and Silver Lake, which are effectively the financial sponsors in this deal, were going to offer each Dell shareholder $13.88 per share. There were 1.69 billion shares outstanding. Dell had, at that time, about $1.4 billion in debt, and it would be refinanced in the deal. Like in most LBOs, any pre-existing debt that existed would basically, you'd have to raise enough money to buy out that pre-existing debt. It wouldn't carry over into the new company. There are a lot of reasons, and we're going to get into those later on. But for now, just understand that in addition to just buying out all the equity, they had to raise enough funds to also take out the existing debt. LTM, last 12 months EBITDA at that time was $3.5 billion. It had been on a bit of a decline and it had gone down 20%, a little over 20% from the prior year. And this was one of the driving rationales for this deal. The market really didn't like where Dell was at, and Michael Dell felt like there was an opportunity to take it private and really improve the operations away from the public sphere. So in terms of the financing of this deal, the sponsors were able to secure $11.5 billion in debt financing to do this deal. So this is a key number here. Obviously, the more debt you can sort of find, the more debt you can put onto the company. As we'll see, the higher the returns will be to the financial sponsors. They were able to secure $11.5 billion in debt. Those of you who have followed the deal know that Microsoft was actually one of the lenders here. In any event, there was also a big part of the financing with $7.7 billion in cash that was sitting on Dell's actual balance sheet. This was Dell Inc.'s balance sheet, not to be confused with Michael Dell specifically. The $7.7 billion in cash on Dell Inc.'s balance sheet that was going to be used to help fund the deal. If you don't have the benefit of that cash, you're going to have to raise more money to do it. But they thought, hey, all that excess cash that's just sitting idle on the balance sheet, well, obviously, since we're going to now own the company, we can use that cash. Now, obviously, the more cash on the balance sheet, the more you're going to have to offer per share. That factors it in. That's why they had to offer this much. Had there been no cash on the balance sheet, the share price would have been lower. In any event, they plan to use all of that balance sheet cash to fund the deal, and the remainder would be funded with equity. And one of your tasks is going to be to figure out exactly what the remainder is. So the critical set of assumptions that we are going to use to figure out what the potential returns are as follows. The exit is assumed to take place 5 years post LBO. Okay. We're going to assume that the same LTM EBITDA exists at exit as it currently is. So that 3.5, it's going to stay 3.5. It's not going to grow, but it's certainly not going to go down either. That's somewhat of an important assumption because LBO EBITDA has been declining. So the assumption is you can sort of stem the tide over the next 5 years and kind of get it at least to 3.5 billion. Let's also assume that the EV/EBITDA multiple at exit is the same as it is currently. I haven't given you what that multiple is, but I've given you all the parameters to figure that out. Once you guys run the numbers, you'll be able to figure out what the enterprise value is currently, and you know what EBITDA is currently, which means you can get the EV/EBITDA multiple currently. And let's assume that same multiple persists through the exit period. These are probably the two key assumptions in an LBO. What is the LTM EBITDA going to be at the exit? Right? So often you need to build a full model for that. That's what we're going to do with our full-fledged case study. Build a model that really sort of try to be a little bit more precise about what we think EBITDA is going to be at exit. And the other assumption is what is the multiple that you can exit at? And the conservative assumption is that you can exit exactly at what you entered, right? Certainly sometimes you exit at higher multiples, sometimes at lower multiples. But the conservative or safe assumption is just assume the same multiple. So these two are critical assumptions, but when you're doing an LBO analysis on a cocktail napkin, these are the kind of, let's keep it simple. Same EBITDA, same multiple. Assume debt is fully paid down and assume no cash persists on the balance sheet at exit. So these are two other pretty important assumptions, which was we're saying, hey, you know what? If this company is generating solid cash flows, the LTM EBITDA of $3.5 billion every year, we're using obviously EBITDA here as somewhat of a proxy for that. We're doing this on a cocktail napkin. We're going to assume that we could probably pay down this $11.5 billion over the next 5 years. There's going to be, assume $3.5 billion in EBITDA for 5 years. That's over $15 billion in EBITDA. Should be enough if all you're doing is trying to pay down debt with your excess cash flows, as opposed to sort of growing your cash balances. You should be able to pay down. So we're going to assume that debt is fully paid down and no cash remains on the balance sheet. Any cash that you sort of generate from EBITDA and operations is going to go fully to funding debt. So these are the key critical assumptions. And the question for you now is going to be, is this a good deal? What is the IRR to the sponsors here? Let's give this a shot. So what I'd like you to do at this point is take a stab at completing this exercise. I'd like you to identify how much was actually used to pay out the equity, to buy the Oldco shareholders. Of course, you have to also factor in that you're going to need to raise enough funds to buy out the Oldco debt. Right? So what is the total amount? And then once you know how much you need, how much you actually need, this is the use of funds, you'll use that to determine exactly how much equity you need to put in place. Given that you've already raised $11.5 billion and $7.7 billion in cash, you can use, because it's sitting on the balance sheet. So you're going to be able to back into what the total equity that's needed in this deal on day one. And once you figure out how much Dell and Silver Lake are putting in, then we can figure out, well, based on the exit assumptions, what's their IRR. So a couple of things you're going to have to kind of get figured out in order to do that is, okay, well, what is the enterprise value today? Well, you're going to figure out what the equity value is, and you're also going to know what the net debt is, because net debt is a function of the existing debt and the existing cash on the balance sheet. So equity value plus net debt is going to give you enterprise value. Then you'll be able to figure out what the EV/EBITDA multiple is. And then you can look at the exit assumptions and say, okay, well, I'm assuming the same multiple here. That enables me, given the same EBITDA assumption as we've had at entry, we can back into enterprise value. It'll be the exact same enterprise value. All right, so the same enterprise value you calculate here, we're assuming is going to persist by the time you exit the company. We're assuming no cash and no debt at exit, which means that your equity value is going to be your enterprise value, and then you'll be able to calculate IRR. So give that a shot, and when you're ready, move on to the next video, and we're going to work through this together.